What if the person you trusted most didn't just listen to your grief, but recorded it? Let that sink in for a second. Because this isn't about a leaked text, or a careless quote, or even a bitter argument caught on camera. This is about something far colder, far more calculated. The allegation that while one family was breaking apart behind closed doors, one member was quietly collecting everything. Every word, every tear, every private conversation that was never meant to leave the room. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And according to what Prince William would later reveal, it wasn't just once. It was systematic. Picture the setting. Not a TV studio, not a press interview, but private rooms inside royal residences. Conversations between brothers, between a son and his father, between a grieving family still trying to hold itself together after loss. Moments where guards relaxed, where aides stepped away, where voices lowered because everyone believed they were safe. Now ask yourself this. If you knew you were being recorded, would you have spoken the same way? William's claim cuts straight through the heart of the royal family's collapse. He alleges that Prince Harry secretly recorded private conversations with King Charles, Queen Camilla, and William himself. And not just during tense negotiations or heated arguments, but during moments of raw vulnerability. Including, allegedly, during the period surrounding Queen Elizabeth's funeral. That's not just shocking. That's devastating. Because funerals are sacred ground, even in broken families. Especially in broken families. And the idea that those moments might have been captured, stored, and later shared with outside producers introduces a question that's impossible to ignore. Where does memory end and exploitation begin? What makes this story explode now isn't just the accusation itself. It's the ripple effect. Suddenly, things that once felt off start to click into place. Lines from the Netflix docuseries that felt oddly specific. Emotional exchanges that sounded less like recollections and more like transcripts. Scenes that raised eyebrows because of how precise they were. Was it storytelling? Or was it playback? William, according to insiders, didn't come to this realization overnight. It built slowly. Through patterns. Through instincts. Through moments that didn't sit right. And when the suspicion finally crystallized into certainty, the response wasn't explosive. It was surgical. Because the most chilling part of this story isn't shouting. It isn't rage. It's restraint. The kind that only comes when someone has already decided something is over. And just when you think this is about betrayal alone, another detail emerges. One that changes the stakes entirely. Royal aides. A device. And an intervention that allegedly happened quietly, without cameras, without statements, and without forgiveness. But the moment that truly shattered everything didn't happen when the recordings were suspected. It happened when William realized what had been captured. Because according to those close to the situation, the most unforgivable recording wasn't taken during an argument. It was taken during a goodbye. What if the most dangerous microphone in the room wasn't on the table, but in a pocket? That's the question that quietly began circulating inside palace walls, long before any confrontation. Long before any accusations were spoken out loud. According to accounts tied to this fallout, suspicion didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in, slowly, uncomfortably, almost politely. At first, nothing seemed obvious. Family gatherings resumed after years of tension, carefully managed, awkward, but civil. The kind of conversations where everyone chooses their words, where pauses feel heavier than sentences. Phones were present, of course. That's normal. Everyone carries one. No one thinks twice about it. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves. Those close to Prince William later described small moments that didn't quite add up. A phone always angled a certain way. A hand that lingered near a jacket pocket during emotional conversations. Sudden exits from rooms right after particularly sensitive exchanges. At the time, it felt like nothing. In hindsight, it felt like everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Royal family members live under constant surveillance from the outside. But inside private rooms, there is an unspoken rule. No recording, no documentation, no receipts. What's said there stays there. It's the last boundary they have. And according to William, that boundary may have been crossed. The alleged recordings weren't said to be limited to one conversation or one person. William would later claim that private talks involving King Charles, Queen Camilla, and William himself were captured without consent. Not arguments staged for leverage. but organic moments. Emotional ones. The kind you only have when you believe no one is listening. Ask yourself this. If you felt someone close to you was quietly archiving your words, how long would it take before trust collapsed? What makes this even more unsettling is how long it allegedly went unnoticed. No alarms. No public blow-ups. No dramatic accusations. Just a growing sense among aides that something was off. That conversations were somehow too neatly remembered, too precisely repeated later, as if recalled verbatim rather than emotionally. That's when whispers reportedly reached the people whose job it is to notice everything. Royal aides are trained observers. They don't speculate lightly. But when multiple people independently feel the same unease, protocols change. Conversations are shortened. Rooms are rearranged. And eyes begin watching the watcher. Then came the moment that shifted suspicion into something far more serious. According to palace insiders, a device was finally questioned. Not seized dramatically. Not shouted about. Quietly. Privately. The kind of intervention designed to avoid scandal at all costs. What exactly was found has never been officially confirmed. But what matters is how people reacted afterward. Because after that moment, everything cooled. Smiles vanished. Doors closed faster. Conversations became formal. And most telling of all, William's demeanor changed. Not to anger. Not to grief. To distance. And distance, in a family like this, is a decision. Because if the suspicion was wrong, nothing needed to change. But if it was right, then the betrayal wasn't emotional. It was strategic. And the next question wasn't whether recordings existed. It was where they ended up. Because what came next would suggest these words didn't stay locked away. They traveled. And once they did, there was no going back. Go. Chapter 2. From private grief to streaming content. Here's the question no one inside the palace wanted to ask out loud. How did private conversations sound so familiar on screen? Not paraphrased. Not loosely remembered. But structured. Precise. Almost scripted. When the Netflix series finally aired, millions watched expecting opinions, perspectives, and personal reflections. That's normal. That's what documentaries do. But among palace staff and royal watchers, something else stood out. Lines that felt too exact. Emotional exchanges that mirrored real conversations people remembered happening behind closed doors. Not in spirit. In wording. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it grew fast. Think about it. Memory is messy. Trauma distorts recollection. Even the most honest person reshapes events over time without meaning to. So when scenes appeared that seemed almost verbatim, it triggered an uncomfortable contradiction. Either Harry had an extraordinary memory under extreme emotional stress, or he didn't need to remember at all. According to what Prince William would later allege, this is where everything crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Because the claim wasn't just that recordings existed. It was that parts of those recordings were shared with producers and used to help shape the narrative of the series. That's not storytelling anymore. That's source material. Ask yourself this. If your most vulnerable moments were transformed into content, would you ever feel safe again? The timing made it worse. Some of the alleged recordings were said to come from one of the most emotionally charged periods in modern royal history. The days surrounding Queen Elizabeth's death. A moment when protocol blurred into grief. When family members spoke not as royals, but as children and siblings saying goodbye. Those conversations were never meant to explain anything to the public. They weren't meant to justify positions or score points. They were raw, unfiltered, and sacred, which is why, according to those close to the situation, the reaction inside the family wasn't just anger. It was revulsion. Behind the scenes, aides reportedly went into damage control mode. Not public relations. Emotional containment. Because once trust is violated at that level, the consequences don't stay professional. They become personal. Every future interaction becomes suspect. Every word feels risky. William, insiders say, didn't explode when the connection between the recordings and the docuseries allegedly became clear. He went quiet. That silence is important. Because people shout when they want answers. They go quiet when they've already reached a conclusion. What made it worse was the implication. If the recordings helped shape the series, then the project wasn't just Harry telling his side of the story. It was built, at least in part, on moments other people never agreed to share. Moments they believed were protected by family loyalty. That realization reportedly hardened something in William that never softened again. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. It wasn't a disagreement that time could heal. It was a line crossed with intention. And once William accepted that, the next move wasn't dramatic. It was final, because the confrontation that followed wouldn't involve shouting, threats, or public ultimatums. It would involve something far colder and far more permanent, because when William finally spoke, he didn't accuse. He judged, and with that judgment, everything Harry thought still existed between them was about to disappear. What happens when anger burns out? And all that's left is certainty? Because when the confrontation finally came, it wasn't explosive. There was no shouting match echoing through palace halls. No slammed doors. No raised voices demanding explanations. According to those familiar with the moment, what made it so terrifying was how controlled it was. Calm can be cruel. By this point, William wasn't asking questions anymore. He wasn't looking for clarifications or justifications. The silence that had settled around him wasn't confusion. It was resolve. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to accuse Harry of anything new. It was to acknowledge something had already died. Trust. Imagine standing in front of someone you grew up with. Someone who walked beside you through childhood, tragedy, and global scrutiny. And realizing that the person in front of you is no longer who you thought they were. That whatever bond once existed has been fundamentally altered. This wasn't framed as a debate. It was framed as a conclusion. Those present say William spoke slowly, carefully, each word chosen with the kind of precision that comes from knowing there will be no second chance to take it back. He didn't reference contracts. He didn't mention producers. He didn't argue about intent. He focused on impact, on consent, on the fact that private family conversations, once recorded and shared, can never be private again. And then came the line that reportedly froze the room. You're not family anymore. No insults. No threats. Just a sentence that carried the weight of a door closing forever. In royal terms, that phrase isn't symbolic. It's structural. Family isn't just emotional in that world. It determines access, proximity, protection, belonging. And with that one sentence, all of it was gone. Ask yourself this. What hurts more, being shouted at or being calmly dismissed? Harry, according to accounts, didn't respond the way many expected. There was no dramatic rebuttal, no emotional breakdown, just shock. The kind that hits when you realize a bridge hasn't just been damaged. It's been removed. From that moment on, everything changed. Communication routes shifted. Interactions became formal, if they happened at all. The warmth that once existed, even beneath tension, vanished. What replaced it wasn't hatred. It was indifference. And indifference is the true opposite of love. The royal aides who had quietly managed logistics now found themselves managing distance. Not for appearances, for protection. Because once someone is no longer considered family, they are no longer afforded the same trust, or access, or benefit of the doubt. But here's the unsettling part. This wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what might still exist. If recordings had been made before, who could say there weren't more? And if there were more, what would happen if they ever surfaced? That question lingered long after the confrontation ended, long after doors closed, long after silence replaced brotherhood. Because exile isn't just about punishment. It's about containment. And as the dust settled, one final realization hung in the air. This story wasn't over. It was only sealed. And what was sealed could still be opened. So here's the question we're left with. When you record everything, what do you actually lose? Because this story was never just about a device, or a docuseries, or even betrayal in the traditional sense. It was about something far more fragile. Consent, trust, the unspoken agreement that some moments exist only because they are never documented. Think back to the beginning. The idea that someone might have been quietly recording private grief, private doubt, private love, not for protection, not for memory, but for potential use later. That single possibility changes everything about how those conversations feel in retrospect. Every pause becomes suspicious. Every vulnerable sentence becomes transactional. And that's why this rupture didn't heal. Because you can forgive anger. You can forgive harsh words spoken in pain. But it's almost impossible to forgive the feeling that someone was collecting you. William's response makes more sense when you view it through that lens. This wasn't about punishing Harry. It wasn't about dominance or control. It was about survival. about drawing a line so clear that it could never be crossed again. "You're not family" anymore wasn't said to wound. It was said to protect. Because once the boundary between family and content collapses, nothing is sacred. And if nothing is sacred, then everything becomes usable. Even funerals. Even final goodbyes. Even moments that were supposed to belong only to those in the room. Ask yourself this honestly. If someone you loved recorded you at your lowest, would you ever speak freely to them again? That's the emotional truth sitting at the center of this story. Not politics. Not contracts. Not press wars. Silence. The silence that follows when trust evaporates and can't be restored, no matter how much time passes. And here's the irony that lingers. In trying to preserve his version of events, Harry may have permanently lost access to the only audience that truly mattered. The people who knew him before narratives, before cameras, before sides were chosen. History may debate intentions. Viewers may argue over fairness. But families don't operate on footnotes and disclaimers. They operate on feeling. And once that feeling is violated, explanations stop working. The royal family didn't just shut a door. They stopped speaking through it. So the real takeaway isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about this. When every moment is recorded, nothing is lived. And when everything becomes content, family becomes collateral. Now I want to hear from you. If these allegations are true, was this documentation or exploitation? Where would you draw the line? And once that line is crossed, can it ever be redrawn? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want deeper breakdowns like this, subscribe. Share this story with someone who still thinks this was just another royal disagreement. Because it wasn't.